What if I told you the largest invasion fleet in history was defeated by a crippled old man with one eye, one arm, and one leg? In 1741, the British Empire sent 186 ships, 2,000 cannons, and nearly 27,000 men to crush a single port city. They were so confident in their overwhelming power, they minted victory medals before the battle even began. They had no idea they were about to face the half-man. This colossal force was the fist of Great Britain, closing around the Spanish colonial prize, Cartagena de Indias. The public pretext for this invasion was a petty diplomatic incident involving a severed ear, a calculated insult used to whip a nation into a war frenzy. But the real prize was empire gold, silver, and the absolute control of the Spanish Main's lucrative trade routes. The man chosen to lead this charge was Admiral Edward Vernon. In the bustling, chaotic port of Portsmouth, Vernon was the toast of London, a national hero basking in the glow of a previous, much smaller victory. He stood on the quarterdeck of his flagship, the HMS Princess Caroline, a magnificent 100-gun ship of the line. Around him, the harbour was a forest of masts, the air filled with the scent of tar and salt water, the shouts of officers, and the thunderous cheers of crowds lining the shore. The weight of an entire nation's pride rested on his shoulders, and he wore it like a comfortable cloak. His ships were the finest in the world, his men the best trained. As he looked upon his armada, he saw not just a fleet, but destiny made manifest, a force that would carve his name into history. Half a world away, in the humid, oppressive heat of the Caribbean, Don Blas de Lezo stood on the highest rampart of Cartagena's defenses. The news of the approaching fleet had already arrived, carried by swift packet boats, and the city below buzzed with a nervous energy, a mix of frantic preparation and quiet dread. Lezo was 52, but his body carried the burden of a century of warfare. His legend had been forged in the inferno of battle and paid for, piece by piece, in his own flesh. His left leg was not merely lost, it was shattered by a cannonball during the bloody siege of Barcelona, then crudely amputated on a bloody deck without anesthetic, as he reportedly refused to be taken below. Years later, his left eye was destroyed by a burst of shrapnel, leaving it a milky, sightless orb that seemed to gaze into the past. His right arm, rendered useless by a musket shot, was a twisted reminder of his survival. He was medio hombre, the half-man. As his one good eye scanned the horizon, he saw not glory, but the grim mathematics of a siege. Turning to his lieutenants, his voice was gravelly, devoid of false hope. "They have the greatest fleet in the world," he stated. "We have courage. Let us see which weighs more." Lezo's soul was the city's defense, but its body was made of stone, earth, and water. Cartagena was the heart of the Spanish Empire in the New World. It was a city of fabulous wealth, protected by the most formidable defenses in the Americas. Its only practical entrance was a narrow, treacherous channel called Boca Chica, or Little Mouth, a death trap guarded on both sides by the massive stone forts of San Luis and San Jose. Beyond them lay the vast inner harbor, and at its heart, the ultimate bastion, the fortress of San Felipe de Barajas. It was an engineering marvel, a mountain of stone with sloping walls built to deflect cannon fire. But these defenses were dangerously undermanned. To face Vernon's 27,000 men, Lezo had at most 6,000, a motley collection of Spanish regulars, local colonial militia, a company of 600 native archers armed with poison-tipped arrows, and a newly formed battalion of freed slaves. As Lezo looked out at the forest of enemy masts that finally blotted out the horizon, he knew his stone walls wouldn't be enough. He would have to rely on a far more treacherous and invisible ally. Their story is a testament to the idea that history is forged by the defiant. If you believe stories like these deserve to be told, make sure you subscribe to our channel for more tales of impossible victories. The invasion began on March 13th. The air itself turned to thunder as Vernon's warships formed a perfect line and unleashed a relentless, methodical bombardment on the forts guarding the Boca Chica Channel. For 16 days and nights, the Spanish defenders inside Fort San Luis endured a living hell. The world was reduced to a series of deafening concussions that felt as if the sky were tearing apart. The stone walls sweat with humidity and shuddered with each impact, sending a constant rain of dust and grit down upon the men, clogging their throats and blinding their eyes. The air, thick with choking black smoke and the acrid smell of burnt powder, was impossible to breathe. Sleep was a forgotten luxury, snatched in moments between cannonades, often interrupted by the screams of the wounded as a cannonball found its mark. The noise was a physical presence that never ceased, a deep, bone-jarring roar that shattered the nerves and made the very ground tremble, a constant reminder of the overwhelming power arrayed against them. Yet the Spanish gunners, commanded by a steadfast officer named Colonel Carlos Desno, refused to break. They became ghosts in the smoke, their faces blackened, their voices raw from shouting over the din. They served their own guns until the barrels glowed red-hot, their defiant shots a mere whisper against the British thunder, but a whisper that still carried death. For the Spanish defenders, the question wasn't if the walls would fall, but how many of them would die before they did. The British, for their part, were stunned by the resilience of the defense. They hurled thousands of cannonballs, expecting a swift collapse, but the Spanish held on with a tenacity that bordered on madness. Finally, after more than 2 weeks of relentless pounding, the walls of San Luis were breached. The British ground forces, led by General Thomas Wentworth, prepared to land. It was a massive, chaotic operation, with thousands of redcoats and 3,500 American colonial volunteers under Lawrence Washington, George Washington's older half-brother, rowing for the beaches under fire from the remaining Spanish guns. The water around their longboats erupted in geysers as Spanish cannonballs slammed into the surf. They stormed the shattered walls of Fort San Luis in a brutal, close-quarters assault, fighting over rubble and the bodies of the fallen in a desperate struggle of bayonets and musket butts. The fighting was savage, a chaotic melee in the ruins where every broken piece of wall was a new defensive position. After hours of bloody combat, superior numbers won out, and the fort was finally taken. Seeing the channel was lost, Lezo made a painful but brilliant decision. He ordered his few remaining warships in the outer harbor to be scuttled. Spanish sailors set their own ships ablaze, rowing away in small boats as the burning vessels groaned and sank into the passage, creating a sunken barrier of masts and rigging that would take the British days to clear, buying Lezo precious time. The British had breached Cartagena's outer defenses, but at a high cost in time and blood. Admiral Vernon, tasting victory, sent a ship back to England with a message. The city was as good as taken. He celebrated his early success, believing the battle was all but over. He had no idea he had just walked straight into Lezo's true trap. Once inside the main harbor, the British advance stalled. A fatal flaw in their command, born of arrogance and jealousy, began to fester. Admiral Vernon despised the army commander, General Wentworth. Their animosity was legendary. They communicated through scathing letters, their camps only a mile apart, their arguments paralyzing the entire invasion force. Vernon urged for an immediate, swift naval assault, while Wentworth, a cautious and indecisive soldier, was intimidated by the sheer scale of Fort San Felipe and argued for a slow, methodical siege. For weeks, they argued, and as they argued, the massive British army sat idle in their swampy encampments on the shore. The tropical heat was oppressive, a physical weight that drained the energy from the unacclimated northern soldiers, their thick wool uniforms, a torment. The water was foul, tasting of mud and decay, and the mosquitoes, the true masters of this land, rose from the stagnant pools in buzzing clouds, their high-pitched whine a constant torment, especially at night. The silent killer Lezo had been counting on began its grim work. It started slowly, a few men with fevers, dismissed as swamp ague, then dozens. Soon, it was a flood. Yellow fever, which the terrified soldiers called black vomit for its final horrific symptom, swept through the ranks. Malaria and dysentery followed, leaving men too weak to even stand. The camp became a hospital, then a morgue. Sanitation broke down completely. The smell of death and human waste hung heavy in the humid air, a constant, sickening miasma that clung to everything. Men who were perfectly healthy one morning would be racked with fever by noon, their skin turning a sickly yellow, and dead by nightfall, their bodies hastily buried in shallow graves that were often washed out by the tropical rains. The American colonists, lacking even the partial immunity of the British regulars, suffered the most, their ranks decimated, morale plummeted. The once proud army was reduced to a collection of ghosts, haunted by the spectre of a death far more terrifying than a Spanish bayonet. As the British command argued, their army began to rot from within. Every day they wasted was a victory for Lazo, and the clock was ticking for General Wentworth to make a final, desperate move. With his army being ravaged by disease and his relationship with Vernon at a breaking point, Wentworth knew he had one last gamble. He had to take Fort San Felipe, and he had to do it now. On the night of April 20th, under a moonless sky, nearly 4,000 of the remaining effective British and American troops moved out. The air was thick with the chirping of insects and the stench of swamp rot as they marched in near silence, their fear a palpable thing, a cold knot in the pit of their stomachs. They were guided by captured Spanish deserters who promised to lead them to a weaker, low-sloping section of the fort's walls. But the guides, either out of incompetence or secret loyalty, led the columns down a narrow, exposed path directly into the strongest killing field of the fort's cannons. As the British columns advanced through the humid darkness, they realized Lazo's genius firsthand. Anticipating their line of attack, he had ordered his men to dig a deep, vertical trench at the base of the fort's walls. It was a simple but brilliant piece of engineering, invisible in the dark. The British ladders, built for the wall's full height, were now uselessly long. Placed in the trench, they were too short to reach the top of the ramparts. Placed behind the trench, they were too far away to bridge the gap. The charge descended into a nightmare of confusion and chaos. Soldiers at the front stumbled into the trench, creating a horrific pile-up of bodies, a kill zone from which they couldn't escape. Officers screamed orders that were lost in the darkness and the rising panic as Spanish cannons, loaded with grape shot, opened up, tearing bloody swathes through their ranks. From the ramparts above, the Spanish defenders, commanded by Lazo himself, a terrifying, one-eyed silhouette against the flashes of cannon fire, unleashed hell. They poured down a devastating storm of musket fire, cannon grape shot, and grenades. The elite British redcoats, the finest infantry in the world, were trapped and slaughtered. As the sun rose, its first light revealed a scene of utter carnage. Lazo, seeing the British wavering, their morale shattered, seized the moment. The fortress gates swung open, and he ordered a ferocious counterattack. A small but determined force of Spanish regulars, their bayonets fixed, stormed out with a vengeful roar, crashing into the disorganized British flank. The attack turned into a full-blown rout. The British and Americans threw down their weapons and fled in terror back towards the fleet, leaving behind their dead, their wounded, their standards, and their honor. The slopes of San Felipe were covered with the bodies of over 1,500 of the attackers. The assault was broken, and with it, the British spirit. Who do you think was the greater factor in the Spanish victory? Lazo's genius or British incompetence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This was the final blow. The British army, now humiliated and demoralized, collapsed completely. The trickle of disease became a torrent. What Spanish cannons couldn't kill, the mosquitoes did. In early May, a council of war was held. The decision was unanimous. Vernon ordered a general retreat. The Great Armada, shattered, plague-ridden, and utterly defeated, limped away from Cartagena in disgrace. Of the nearly 27,000 men who had arrived with such confidence, an estimated 18,000 were now dead or incapacitated, the vast majority from disease. It was one of the most lopsided and humiliating defeats in the history of the British Empire. The Great British Armada limped home in disgrace. Vernon became a pariah, the story of his defeat suppressed by an embarrassed government. And Blas de Lezo, the man who had achieved the impossible, would not live to enjoy his victory. Wounded by a cannonball during the final battle, He succumbed to typhus shortly after, brought down by the pestilence of the unburied dead. He died a hero but was buried in an unmarked grave, his location still unknown to this day. The victory medals, struck in arrogant certainty, became relics of a phantom victory, a national shame to be hidden away. If this forgotten piece of history moved you, share this video so the story of the half-man and his impossible defense is not forgotten again. The Battle of Cartagena de Indias is more than a military upset. It is a brutal lesson in the cost of pride. It proves that the size of an army is no match for the will of a single defiant soul. Thank you for joining us for this piece of history. If you want to see more stories of the incredible battles and forgotten heroes that shaped our world, make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell. We'll see you next time.